So, do you know what's pretty interesting? The brain. It is probably my favourite body part to learn about. There's just so much stuff in there, and I love it. Not to go over old stuff again, but I did just study biomedical science at Warwick Uni, so this video isn't just coming out of thin air. I do have a bit of an education around it, so just to let you know. I'm going to be talking about a pretty interesting topic today, which is this idea of implicit and explicit attitudes and biases, and how they influence our attitudes, our decision making, our opinions, our actions, everything like that. I've seen far too many blog posts and magazine articles recently that talk about like, implicit biases are real and they mean we're all racist and homophobic and sexist and blah blah blah, and that's just really oversimplifying things way too much. Today I'm hopefully going to expand on the topic a little bit, explain to you exactly what's happening inside the brain and what it means for us, and how implicit biases aren't necessarily that bad, and if we want, we can actually overcome them, so it's not too much of an issue. I am going to be assuming you guys have a little bit of a basic knowledge of the brain, but I am also going to be kind of simplifying things down a bit and not going into too much detail on a cellular level or anything like that, because I want to try and make this accessible to as many people as possible. So let me know, give me a little bit of feedback, tell me if this is too complex or too simplified, and I can adapt it in my videos in the future. So to start with, I want to talk a little bit about the basics of the idea of a conscious and unconscious brain, things like that. Today it's pretty much a given that we have a conscious part of the brain and an unconscious part. People accept it, people know they're there, but that wasn't always the case. But the fact is, there's so much more going on in the brain than we are aware of as individuals. Like, while you're watching this video, for example, right, you might be conscious of what I'm saying in terms of, like, actually trying to understand me, figuring out what the hell this accent is, trying to make sense of the facts I'm telling you, and possibly kind of thinking back and connecting it to knowledge you already have or that you heard somewhere else. That's all probably going on consciously as you're watching this. But there's a lot going on that you're not aware of. There's the basic stuff like translating light information and sound data into pictures and words, interpreting language and figuring out what these noises that I'm making actually mean. Plus, while all this is going on, your autonomic nervous system is monitoring everything else going on in your body. Have you got enough oxygen? Have you got enough glucose? How's your temperature? Are you too warm? It's quite warm in here actually. And if you are, better fix it. It adapts. The autonomic stuff is what keeps your heart beating, your lungs breathing. And usually it's stuff that we can't override, but it's always going on. But there's a lot of unconscious stuff going on in your brain as well that controls your thought processes, even if you don't realise it. I mean, like, have you ever just looked at someone and thought you really disliked them without having any kind of conversation with them, without having met them, without knowing them? You just get this instant dislike of someone and you don't know why. Or have you kind of like acted in the heat of the moment where you've been like emotionally triggered or stressed by something, and you know, you acted really out of character and later you've been like, why did I do that? Chances are your unconscious mind kicked in and your implicit attitudes that you didn't even know were there had some kind of influence over your actions and your behaviour. It's pretty cool, to be honest. So first thing to make clear when we're talking about the brain is that the brain isn't really split up into these special little areas like some people think. There's no single area that just deals with decision making, or there's no single area that just deals with telling you that you're hungry. There are general brain regions that kind of deal with certain areas, like this area kind of does audio stuff, this area kind of does visual stuff, but it's all kind of very basic and general, and generally all different areas of the brain work together in special ways. For example, when we talk about processing emotional information, for example, we're going to be utilising the amygdala, the hippocampus, the brainstem, and they're all going to be talking to each other, communicating in different ways. And all this happens without us realising. It's kind of amazing, to be honest. I mean, this goes a little further when, let's say we talk about like moral judgments or something like that. So we have to make a decision, like, is this thing that I'm going to do morally good or not? You have to decide whether you want to do it based on how it's going to affect you and the people around you, right? So much stuff goes on in your brain for you to come to those conclusions. You have to process the emotional information, process complex emotions like empathy, and then start to apply like logic and reason to your decision making. And there's so much of your brain that's involved. In the frontal lobe, the medial orbital frontal complex kind of gets activated, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. In the limbic system, you've got the amygdala, the hippocampus working, and just loads of different areas of your brain all working together. And because the same regions are involved in different functions, you know, just taking those ones I just mentioned, the amygdala, the hippocampus, the frontal lobe, things like that, these are also involved in social perceptions, norm compliance, and just kind of influencing our daily lives and how we interact with other people and helping us figure out the best way to react in certain situations. So basically what I'm saying is there's a hell of a lot going on in the brain. Different areas work together in different ways. You have all these crazy pathways going on in your brain, crossing over, interacting. It's kind of amazing. And there's a lot going on while we're learning and figuring things out and forming opinions. And a lot of this we're not even aware of. I mean, most learning through socialization is processed non-consciously. So when we learn things from others, like watching other people, mirroring them, and seeing how people respond to each other, things like that, we're not even aware that we're learning most of the time. And later, if we realise we picked up something new, we can't always go back and figure out who or what actually influenced us. It's just suddenly in our brain and suddenly we know how to do something. And as we observe the world around us and we start to learn, that's how our implicit and explicit attitudes are formed. Explicit attitudes are a little bit simpler, so I'm going to start by talking about them. They tend to be deliberate, we're aware of them. I can say I'm an atheist, I'm not racist, you know, basic things like this. They're opinions and judgments that we know we have, we've probably come to them through some deliberate and logical reasoning, we generally know exactly how we came to them, we know what influenced us, we know why we think them, and we can justify them. Usually these explicit attitudes are processed primarily in the frontal lobe of the brain. And when we have time to stop and make a considered decision on something, we usually call upon this little bit of the brain here to make a measured choice. We call upon these explicit attitudes. We think, well, I'm an atheist, so I'm going to behave in this way. Or we might think, well, I believe this about something, so I'm going to do this because it will be better for these people, and so on. Basically, it's all the stuff that I like. It's logic and reasoning. So basically, great stuff, right? And if we were just controlled by our explicit attitudes, things would be great. But our explicit and implicit attitudes don't always line up. Implicit attitudes are a little bit trickier. We're not always aware that we actually have these opinions or views or biases towards certain groups of people or certain things. We don't usually have any idea what's even influenced us. They're usually heavily influenced by the past and things we've experienced there, but they tend to be primed by current events. So basically, you can see something, you can hear something, you could even smell something, and it triggers something in the emotional centers of your brain in areas like the amygdala and other parts of the limbic system. And suddenly the brain's being influenced by these implicit attitudes. They arise so quickly and non-consciously that we're not even aware that they're affecting our actions. And because we're not aware of them all the time, it can be really difficult because they can distort our cognitive processes. They can stop certain neural pathways being used. They can force us into acting a certain way, and we don't even know that's going on. We don't realize. For a while, this idea of implicit biases or implicit attitudes, it was just kind of a theory, but recently they have kind of been confirmed, and we're kind of certain that they're there now. I mean, for example, in 2014, David Amodio, I hope I'm pronouncing his name right, he did this study where he took fMRI scans of people's brains, well actually men's brains, and he found that when they were thinking about certain groups of people, and they did have kind of racial biases, that their amygdala was, it was triggered, it was working. I haven't really explained that too well, but it's actually a really interesting paper if you want to go and read it. I'll put up a link in the description below, and I'll also be including links to all my references, sources, and a little bit of extra reading if you want to go and kind of find out some more stuff about these ideas, because it's a really interesting topic. So what exactly is going on in the brain to form these implicit attitudes, to make us call upon them? Let's use racial bias as a really basic example, because studies have been done on it and it's proven that there are racial biases in some people. Warning, this could make me sound like an SJW. I know I've said this before, but bear with me until the end and it will make sense, I hope, and not make me sound too kind of cringy and crazy. So, like I say, really basic example, I'm not saying this happens to anyone, by no means, but let's imagine from a young age you're surrounded by people who are openly racist. You hear the people you love and trust saying really negative things about black people, for example. One time on TV, you see a black person playing a villain and he scares you. When that happens, neural pathways are forming in your brain, particularly in the amygdala, and you're associating black people with making people you care about sad or angry. You're associating that one black character with feelings of fear. Now this is important because if it only happened once or twice, it probably wouldn't have that much of an effect. But this is kind of where your brain can work against you. So if you know anything about sort of neurons in the brain, they're your basic brain cells. The axons of the neurons can be coated in this thing called myelin. Myelin acts as a kind of insulator around the neurons to increase the speed that information is passed down the axon and onto the next neuron. So it speeds up these neural pathways. What's interesting is that the more myelin there is, the faster the reaction. But also, the more a certain pathway is used, the more myelin's added. The more you use a pathway, the faster it becomes. The faster a pathway is, the more likely the brain is to use it, and then the faster it becomes. And it is this big cycle. So these implicit attitudes usually arrive because you have these super fast pathways in your brain. Is this making sense so far? This means that even years on, when you're triggered by some kind of emotional stimulus, maybe you're scared, the fastest pathway that's going through the amygdala will be the first one to respond, and your implicit attitudes will be the biggest influence on your actions. That's why, if you have a negative implicit bias, like black people make me feel fear, that's why when you're in a scary situation, maybe there's a group of people, your first reaction might be to jump and assume that the black person is causing you to be scared. He or she is the one that is the problem. It is jumping to conclusions, there's nothing rational about it, but that's the thing with implicit attitudes and implicit biases. They're not rational. But that is just one example. And it's really important to note that just because implicit attitudes and implicit biases exist, they're not all bad. They don't necessarily mean that we're all secretly racist and homophobic or sexist, or we all hate X group of people. Implicit biases can be good too. I mean, maybe you're more likely to trust people with dark hair because your parents had dark hair when you were younger. I don't know, something like that. They're not necessarily an inherently bad thing. And while implicit biases are hard to change, they're hard to identify, it can be done. I mean it slowly. People always refer to the amygdala as being quick to learn, slow to forget, which means that it's very, very hard to change these attitudes and biases that you might not be aware of, but it is possible. So, very quick summary. We all have implicit attitudes and biases. They are opinions which we hold which we might not be aware of. They can cause us to act instinctively. They don't always align with our explicit attitudes, and they're not always logical. But how do we go about figuring out what our implicit biases and attitudes are? Well, you can start by just taking a bit of a critical look at yourself and your past actions. Look at how you've acted in the past, especially in kind of times of heightened emotions, especially times when you just thought you went with your gut instinct, you know what I mean? Look for any patterns of behaviour and see if you reckon you have any biases or not, simple as that. Or you can take a test online. Harvard came out with the Harvard Implicit Association Test, which a lot of people find useful, and apparently it tells you what your implicit biases are. But then what? So now you're suddenly aware of your implicit attitudes, your implicit biases, and you might want to change them. You might not. But if you do, it might be as simple as making sure you just stop before you act. This is difficult for people who might be police or some other kind of person who is regularly in situations where you have literally a couple of seconds to act. This can be really difficult for those kinds of people. But for everyone else, say you work in an office or a shop or whatever like that, in your day-to-day life, you can just make sure that you take the time to stop and think about what you're doing and kind of consider your actions. You want to engage your frontal lobe, not just rely on the quick emotional response of the amygdala. It's tricky, but studies have been done to show that you can override your implicit attitudes with a little bit of logical thinking, a little bit of rationality, and using this frontal lobe. So, to sum this up, if you ask me, implicit biases are super interesting. They can help explain a lot of things about the way people act in certain situations, but they're just that. They're an explanation, they're not an excuse. And they're also not something that we should kind of blame people for. I think it's important to be aware that we have them and that they're influencing our actions, even if we're not aware exactly what they are. I like to think of myself as logical and rational, but there are plenty of times when I know my emotions have taken over and I know I'm being influenced by them and I might be acting rashly, or I don't know. But I think as long as I'm aware of them and I know that I can try and change them, I think that's a really important thing. But I want to hear your thoughts on this. What did you think of this video? Did you find the information interesting? I definitely recommend going and reading some of the links below, especially some of the journal articles, because they're really, really interesting. I'm also going to link a couple of books that I've read on the topic as well. There's a couple of textbooks, there's a couple of kind of popular science books that are a little bit easy to read and digest. But it's a really, really interesting topic, and I've literally only covered the basics here. There's so much more we can talk about, but I would love to know your thoughts. And for now, sorry if this video was long, but thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it, and I'll see you again soon. This is Cinnamon, by the way. He is my beautiful little bear with his slightly wonky face. Mwah. Love you, Cinnamon. Cinnamon, say bye.